I have a slight worry that the topic might be a bit too niche, a bit too specialised for some of you. But I will try and keep as many of you as possible on board for as long as possible. And also I'm very happy to take any clarificatory questions as I'm going along. So other questions can wait till the Q&A, but if you have a purely clarificatory question, I'm very happy for you to put your hand up and I can repeat or rephrase what I've just said. So the title, as you can see, is Buddhism, Nyāya and Śaivism on the Existence of Selves. And the talk will be divided into three parts. In the first part, we'll look at the debate between Nyāya and Buddhism. I'll then introduce the view of one branch of Shaivism, in particular the view of Brahmacanta, and then we'll finish by looking at the debate between Shaivism and Buddhism. So let's go straight to Nyāya versus Buddhism. And when I give an account of the kind of self that was postulated by Nyāya, I like to make this triple distinction between three ways in which Nyāya philosophers, Nyāyikas, conceived of the self. So we have self as the unitary essence of a person, self as the owner of certain qualities, substance in which certain qualities inhere, and self as agent. So let's go first to self as unitary essence. So in this diagram, the line underneath Nyāya is supposed to represent the self as conceived of by Nyāya. The idea is that as we move forward in time, as you go from the left to the right of the diagram, self persists. Self remains numerically identical. It remains one and the same thing over time. Whereas that is not the case for Buddhism. So the diagram under Buddhism is supposed to illustrate that we do not persist over time. For Buddhism, everything that exists is momentary. It only exists for a single moment. So for Buddhism, we don't have a self. We are not a self. We're rather a stream of consciousness in which every moment of consciousness is numerically distinct from neighbouring moments. So what I am in this moment is not what I was in the previous moment. And it so happens that Buddhism deconstructs the supposed unitary essence of a person, not only synchronically, not only across time, but also, not only diachronically, but also synchronically. That's to say, for Buddhism, it's the case that we are not one thing, not only across time, but even at every single instance of time. We are actually five things: consciousness, particular state of consciousness, plus the four other constituents of a person for Buddhism, known in Buddhism as the five skandhas. So moving on now to self as the owner of certain qualities, such as consciousness, or the substance in which these qualities inhere. So here the big circle represents the self, the Atman, that which was depicted in the previous diagram by a straight line. Here this big circle is the self, and the five small circles are five things which, according to Nyāya, are qualities of the self, namely consciousness, pleasure, pain, desire, aversion. Whereas for Buddhism, consciousness and the other four skandhas exist as part of a plurality, exist as part of a conglomerate, part of a bundle, without belonging to any owner, without adhering in any substance, without having any single thing that locates them. Is this correct?
You okay? Yeah, I think we can go on. Okay, my idea. I think it's fine.
Now these three conceptions of the self, which I laid out on the earlier slide, correspond to three different ways in which Buddhists oppose the existence of the self. So Buddhism used different arguments to oppose each of these three conceptions of the self. And here, when Buddhists oppose this particular conception of the self, the arguments they deploy are arguments that they use against the existence of any substance over and above qualities. So Buddhism denied the existence of any substances over and above qualities, which means this big circle on the left could represent some other substance other than the self, let's say a mango fruit substance, in which case the five small circles represent the smell, taste, colour, etc. of mango. These five qualities of a mango corresponding to our five sense faculties. Whereas for Buddhism, a mango is not one thing. It's those five things: smell, taste, colour, etc. A mango is those five things, existing at the same time in the same place, without belonging to any unity. And now we can move on to the third of these three conceptions: self as agent, i.e. agent both of physical movements, bodily movements, physical actions, and agent of mental actions. So cognizer of cognitions, thinker of thoughts, perceiver of perception. Now, Nyāya and its what we call sister school, Vaisheshika. Nyāya and Vaisheshika both frequently compared the self to a puppeteer. Just as a puppeteer stands above the puppet, bringing into being the bodily movements of the puppet below, so similarly the self stands above the stream of mental and physical actions, bringing them into being. And that's partly why I've drawn the diagram in this way, with the blue circles representing mental and physical actions, hanging down by strings, as it were, from the horizontal line which represents the self. That's agents, the art as agent. Well, for Buddhism, if you ask what is the agent of a particular action, such as when I move my right arm, for Buddhism, that is simply what is the cause of that action. And the Buddhist answer, what is the cause of that action, is simply the momentary intention to move my arm, which occurred in my stream of consciousness immediately preceding that movement. And if we're talking about mental actions, not physical actions, then for Buddhism, there is no cognizer over and above the cognition. The thinker just is the thought. The thing doing the perceiving just is the perception that's occurring at that moment in my stream of consciousness. So here you can see Buddhism replaces a kind of two-tier model with just a one-tier model, and as it were, reduces the agent into the stream of consciousness. So now we've given that introduction to the two different positions, the Nyāya position, the Buddhist position on the self. We can now look at what's called the Nyāya argument from desire for the existence of a self against the Buddhists. And this is the argument that occurs in the commentaries to Nyāya Sutra 1110. It's the principal Nyāya argument for the self at least until the end of the first millennium. Now, this argument asks us to consider a situation in which you feel pleasure from a certain object, perhaps a kind of object you've never experienced before, never encountered before. You get some pleasure from that. Then you see that object sometime subsequently, and hence you feel desire for it. And this is something that both sides of this debate, the Nyaya philosophers and the Buddhists, agree happens. We do feel pleasure for objects which have given us, we do feel desire for things which have given us pleasure in the past. But the Nyaya contention is that this would not happen were it not the pleasure, the seeing, and the desire all sharing one common agent, one common subject. So why does the Nyaya feel entitled to make that claim? Why does the Nyaya feel entitled to make this claim that the very existence of desire in cases such as this implies a continuous self? Well, they compare the situation with a similar situation but involving two people. So here you have person X and person Y. And person X experiences some pleasure. And then a few weeks later, a totally different person, person Y, on the other side of the world, who's never spoken to person X, sees that object, or sees an object of that kind. In that case, desire will typically not arise. And both sides also agree about this. Both the Buddhists and the Nyayikas agree that not only will desire typically arise in figure 1, but it will typically not arise in figure 2. But what the Nyayika does is juxtapose these two situations and conclude that the reason desire arises in figure 1 but does not arise in figure 2 is because we have a common agent of the pleasure and the seeing in situation 1. But we have two different subjects, two different agents of the pleasure and the seeing in figure 2. Well, if that's the case, if that's the reason why desire does not arise in figure 2, then imagine what will be the case if figure 3 is actually the correct way of envisaging what one person is. Figure 1 depicts what one person is according to Nyaya, i.e. a continuously existing self. Figure 3 depicts what one person is according to Buddhism, a stream of consciousness, a stream of separate moments of consciousness, separate subjects of consciousness. If that's what a person is, then the Nyayika argues desire would not arise. Because just as we saw that desire does not arise in figure 2, where we have a separate subject of the pleasure, a separate subject of the seeing. So in figure 3 we have a separate subject of the pleasure and a separate subject of the seeing. So desire should not arise there, but we all know that we do feel desire for things which have given us pleasure in the past. Therefore, figure 3 cannot be the correct characterization of a person. So that's the Nyaya argument. Let me just pause to see if people have understood the argument before we then move on to evaluate the argument.
Could you just repeat that? Seeing and desiring. I'm not sure.
So the situation is when you feel pleasure from any kind of object. It could be that you've never tasted gulab jamun before. You taste it for the first time, it gives you some pleasure. 2 weeks later, you see another one at the same time, so you feel desire to eat it. And the point is that both sides agree that we do feel desire. desire in situations like that. We do typically desire things which have caused us pleasure in the past. But if you compare that with a different situation involving two people, where someone else gets pleasure from the gulab jamun, and someone who's never experienced pleasure from that kind of food sees it later, they typically won't feel desire. And the Nyāya argument is implying that since desire does not arise in figure 2, it would not arise in figure 3. Where figure 3 is what a person is as envisaged by Buddhism. Well, if it's true that desire would not arise in figure 3, that implies that figure 3 is not the correct way of envisaging a person. Because we know that we do typically feel desire for things which have given us pleasure in the past. So this is the argument that Nyāya used to establish the existence of the self against the Buddhists. Now, I think that actually this argument is quite easy for the Buddhists to reply to. Because you may have noticed that the crucial move in the argument was to say that since desire does not arise in figure 2, it would not arise in figure 3. But actually, the Buddhist has readily available means of distinguishing the figure 2 situation from the figure 3 situation. Because the Buddhist can just point out that in figure 2, there's no continuous line of causation running from the earlier pleasure to the later seeing. So of course person Y will not feel desire when they see this object. They've never experienced any pleasure from that kind of object before, and they don't have any access to person X's pleasure. They've never spoken to person X. Whereas in figure 3, there's a continuous line of causation running from the earlier pleasure to the later seeing. Because in the Buddhist model of a person, Buddhist model of a stream of consciousness, each moment causes the next moment to arise. So you have this continuous line of causation, which means that a memory trace of the earlier pleasure can be laid down in the next moment, and then can be, as it were, passed along the chain. So that the subject of the seeing, that moment of consciousness which sees the object, will have contained within itself a memory trace of the earlier pleasure, which can be activated by the similarity of this presently perceived object to the earlier pleasure-giving object. That similarity of the present gulab jamun to the past one triggered a memory of the effect that eating the past one had on one, and therefore trigger memory of the pleasure, and therefore desire can arise in figure 3. So I think the only way this argument can work would be if it was clearly established that the reason desire does not arise here is because we have two separate subjects, the pleasure and the seeing. Then it would be true that desire would not arise in figure 3. Because for the Buddhist, the pleasure and the seeing do have separate subjects. But the Buddhist has a perfectly plausible alternative explanation for why desire does not arise in figure 2. Namely, that non-arising of desire is not because of there being two subjects, but rather because of there being no line of causation running from the pleasure to the seeing. Because there is such a line of causation in figure 3, the Buddhist has a ready explanation for why it is that pleasure can arise, but pleasure typically does not arise in figure 2, but can arise in figure 3. So that's the end of the first part about Nyāya versus Buddhism. Now, we turn to the view of Ramakanta. Who was Ramakanta? He lived in Kashmir.
Yeah, so just wanted to ask you what precisely is the line of causation?
What is the line of causation here? Well, the Buddhist theory of a stream of consciousness, the Buddhist model of a stream of consciousness is that each moment of consciousness causes the next moment to arise in partial likeness of itself. And as part of the Buddhist theory, therefore, that if I experience pleasure in this moment, if it's a pleasure which is significant enough to be rememberable later, that pleasure will lay down a memory trace, what Nyāya has called samskara, what Buddhists tend to call vasana. These memory traces were accepted by both sides. So it's not that the Buddhist here is sort of smuggling in some ad hoc way something which only they accept. Nyāya has also explained memory by this model of memory traces. And in the Buddhist model, for Nyāya, these memory traces are stored in the self. But for Buddhism, there is no self, there's just a stream of consciousness. So these memory traces are stored within the stream of consciousness. Because each moment of consciousness conditions the arise of the next moment of consciousness. That means that the next moment of consciousness will arise with a likeness of the memory traces contained in previous moments. So in each moment there's a kind of imprinting of a new moment of consciousness, each one conditioned by the previous moment, arising in partial likeness of the previous moment. So it's that kind of causation between moments. Ramakansa lived in Kashmir at the end of the 10th century. He belonged to one of the two main branches of Shaivism, namely Shaiva Siddhanta, which survives today only in the Tamil-speaking south of India. But in that period, up until the 12th century, existed all over India, including in Kashmir. That branch of Shaivism, Ramakansa's branch, Shaiva Siddhanta, we could say was pluralistic, as opposed to the other branch of Shaivism, which was non-dualistic. What do I mean by that? The other branch of Shaivism, which was the branch whose protagonists were Somananda, Uttaradeva, Abhinavagupta, professor that he works on, Abhinavagupta, and Shemaraja. That non-dualistic branch of Shaivism held that ultimately there's only one self in the universe. Whereas Ramakansa's Shaiva Siddhanta held that all of our selves are separate. All of our selves are independent from each other and never merge. Even if we attain moksha, even if we attain liberation, we retain our separate individuality. So that's very different from the view of non-dualistic Shaivism or Advaita Vedanta, where the attainment of moksha means the loss of individual identity, the merging into the one real greater whole. Now, how does Ramakansa's view relate to the view of Nyāya and Buddhism? Well, Ramakansa, like Nyāya philosophers, sought to overcome the Buddhist theory of no self by putting forward arguments in favour of the existence of self. So in that sense, Ramakansa is aligned with Nyāya, where main enemy for both of them was Buddhism and the Buddhist theory of no self. But actually, Ramakansa agreed with Buddhism that there is no self over and above consciousness. Ramakansa agreed with Buddhism that there is no self-substance over and above consciousness. There is no self-agent over and above consciousness. So you might wonder then, how did he we preserve the existence of the self? Well, the answer is by equating self and consciousness. So for Ramakanta and for other Shaivas, including the non-dualistic Shaivas, self and consciousness are simply two ways of referring to the same thing. So, we could say that whereas for Nyāya there is a self that exists over and above consciousness, for Buddhism there is no self, there's just consciousness. For Ramakanta there is a self, but it is consciousness. So it's as though Ramakanta reduces the self to consciousness, but then argues that consciousness is persisting, numerically identical over time. You can see that Ramakanta then disagrees with both Nyāya and Buddhism, in that for both Nyāya and Buddhism, consciousness is momentary. Consciousness is divided up into discrete momentary instances, whereas for Ramakanta it's not. It always endures, persists. So that's all I'm going to say on the Ramakanta's positive view. And the rest of the talk will all be about his negative view, i.e. his arguments against Buddhism. And we're going to look at three of Ramakanta's arguments against Buddhism. And we'll see if maybe they will be harder for the Buddhists to respond to than the Nyāya argument. So Ramakanta begins his argumentation against Buddhism by appealing to phenomenal continuity. What does that mean? By appealing to the claim that we experience ourselves as continuously existing. So his point is that as we proceed through life experiencing many different objects of perception, nevertheless, the perceiver of those objects appears to us as always one and the same. After all, we never lose a sense that it's the same me who is the experiencer of all of my experiences. When I talk about perceiving objects and perception, I'm not only talking about objects in the external world, I'm also talking about our experience of pleasure, pain, our experience of thoughts, our experience of images and dreaming. All of those things, pleasure, pain, thoughts, dream images, they're all considered to be objects of experience. Objects of perception, you could say, using perception in a slightly wider sense. And on this view, those objects are always changing, but there's an unchanging perceiver, experiencer of all of those objects. Yeah.
Small clarification. So Ramakanta is saying that the self also continues in sleep, right?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, everyone who believes in the existence of the self thinks that the self continues in sleep. Because that would be weird if when you fell asleep, your self stopped.
Yeah, but here for Ramakant, if he's equating self with consciousness,
Exactly.
consciousness should.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. That what is particular and distinctive and interesting and understandable that you brought it up is the fact that Ramakanta combines that idea that the self continues throughout deep sleep with equating the self with consciousness. So that means that, yeah, Ramakanta consciousness continues in deep sleep, in states of coma, states of general anesthetic. There is the Ramakanta consciousness even then. So Ramakanta begins his argumentation with Buddhism by this sort of initial appeal to phenomenology. Appeal to a phenomenology which purportedly presents the perceiver to itself, presents us to ourselves as one and the same over time, as unchanging, as persisting over time, numerically identical over time, despite the changing content of our experiences. Now, this article by Josh Parsons called Phenomenological Argument of Stage Theory, he points out that there are two ways in which one can respond to an argument from phenomenology. Two ways which he claims are often not clearly distinguished. One can either deny that the person giving the argument has the phenomenology they report, or one can accept that they do have that phenomenology, but explain that it is the result of an illusion. Now, the Buddhists respond to this kind of argument not in the first way, but in the second way. The Buddhists do not deny that we have this sense of unbroken personal identity. They even have a Buddhist word for it, Satkaya Drishti. And the whole Buddhist Eightfold Path, the whole Buddhist soteriological teaching, is designed to overcome this sense of ourselves as continuously existing over time. So if we didn't have this phenomenology of continuity, there would be no need for a Buddhist path. So they don't go for option one, they go for option two. They explain away this phenomenology we have of thinking of ourselves as always the same, extended in time. They explain it away as an illusion. How do they do that? By using certain analogies. So it's like the case of looking at a video of a person projected on a screen. Well, you think you're looking at one continuously existing person. What you're actually looking at is different, discrete film images projected one after another at speed, where each one resembles the previous one very closely. Or, to use the example that Buddhists in this period themselves use, it's like looking at a very calm river, where you think you're looking at just one unmoving block of water, but actually you're looking at lots of different bits of water rushing by. So similarly, according to the Buddhists, when we think we're experiencing ourselves as temporally extended and unchanging one thing over time, what we're actually experiencing is a sequence of separate, momentary perceivers. But, as in the case of those two examples I just gave, we're fooled by the rapidity with which each one succeeds the previous one, and the similarity of each one to the previous one, into thinking that we're looking at one thing rather than many. So that's the Buddhist way of explaining away this phenomenology of continuity as an illusion. Buddhists claim to use their own terminology. They claim that we superimpose oneness onto what is actually plural. We superimpose persistence onto what is actually momentary. So how does Ramakanta respond to this? He claims that the Buddhist does not actually provide an adequate account of how we superimpose oneness onto ourselves. Our consciousness comes to be mistaken about its temporality. So Ramakanta points out that there's a distinction between superimposing oneness onto something other than ourselves and superimposing oneness onto ourselves. What Ramakanta is saying is it's perfectly understandable, it's uncontroversial, that we sometimes superimpose oneness onto external things, as in the case of the film of a person or the river. That's totally understandable, that's totally uncontroversial, everyone can agree that that happens. What happens there is we're superimposing oneness onto something other than ourselves. But what you Buddhists are asking us to believe is that we superimpose oneness onto ourselves. To put it even more precisely, you're asking us to believe that a sequence of separate, momentary perceivers experience themselves as one, superimpose oneness onto themselves. And it's harder to see how or why that could be the case. It's harder to see how or why a sequence of momentary perceivers could experience themselves as one thing. And here there are sort of two halves to Ramakanta's point. There are two halves.
What's the word he used to superimpose?
Adhyaropa.
Adhyaropa.
On the one hand, what Ramakanta is saying here is that these Buddhist examples don't instantiate what they need to instantiate. The Buddhist examples don't make plausible what they need to make plausible. What they need to make plausible is a sequence of separate things experiencing themselves as one. But that's not what's happening in these examples. It's not that the film images, the film frames, are experiencing themselves as one, or experiencing themselves as joined up with the neighbouring film images. It's not that the bits of water in the river are experiencing themselves as one unmoving block of water. That's Ramakanta's first point. You shouldn't be fooled into thinking that these Buddhist examples actually make the view plausible. And secondly, Ramakanta points out that what the Buddhist is claiming here seems to contradict things that the Buddhists claim elsewhere. So this particular branch of Buddhism, which I've been concerned with in this talk, and which Ramakanta was concerned with, is the branch of Buddhism which began with Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Koshabhasha, was continued by Dignaga, by Dharmakirti, and by Dharmakirti's followers. And for Dignaga and Dharmakirti, every moment of consciousness experiences itself non-conceptually. A non-conceptual experience is always accurate. So that means that for these Buddhists, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, consciousness always experiences itself accurately. It may be mistaken about the objects it experiences, but it experiences itself accurately. That seems to mean that if consciousness experiences itself as persisting, it should be persisting. So I'll just take 5 minutes more for the final two arguments, which won't take long. This second argument also targets this Buddhist idea that we superimpose persistence onto what is momentary. Now, the standard example in Sanskrit philosophy of superimposition is that of superimposing silver onto mother of pearl. Sometimes we also find the idea of superimposing the idea of a snake onto a rope, but even more common is mother of pearl, silver onto mother of pearls. You're walking along the beach, you see some mother of pearl shell, you think it's silver, superimpose the concept of silver onto what is not actually silver. Now it's quite clear there that you would not mistake the mother of pearl for silver unless you'd experienced silver in the past, in order to thereby acquire the concept of silver to then superimpose it. But in the Buddhist universe, in which absolutely everything is momentary, perceivers and perceived objects, where or how could anyone who've ever experienced anything persisting, in order to acquire the concept of persistence, in order to superimpose it onto what is momentary? I think what I'll do is I'll pause there. There's one more argument which, if anyone's interested or if the questions run dry, we can look at, but otherwise I think that's enough for now.
Do we moderate questions? I mean, what do you want to do? Okay, I guess then let's keep it open. Yeah. Let's start with questions. We have a few arguments. Do you find these arguments convincing? The students in the room especially. Do you find these arguments convincing? Who do you think thinks make more sense? What do you think? Do you think you have some phenomenological continuity? Do you agree with the Buddhists? What do you think? Yeah,
one of the first argument when Ramakanta points out that why that there's a difference between superimposing oneness to someone, to another thing compared to our own self. I was also thinking about whether that would rather than be more difficult, would we also not perceive it as being rather easier? Because if it is for Buddhists, it is causation, right? So maybe for them in causation, it's easier for the yogis to perceive a oneness for themselves rather than for something else. Maybe that's why it's superimposition.
I see. So the question is about this first of Ramakanta's three arguments, where the Buddhist is explaining away this phenomenology we have, the way in which we experience ourselves as one undivided, continuously existing thing. The Buddhist tries to explain that away by saying that, yeah, we may think we're experiencing ourselves as one, but actually what's happening is we're experiencing a sequence of separate, momentary subjects, momentary experiences, sequence of separate moments of consciousness, but it's happening so quickly, and each one is so similar to the one before that we think we're experiencing one unbroken thing in a way that you think you're looking at one unbroken person, when in fact you're looking at separate frames being projected one after the other. Now, Ramakanta's response is to say, yeah, that happens. Of course, it can happen that you're looking at a plurality of separate frames and you think you're actually looking at just one person. That's easy to explain and that's uncontroversial, but that's because those sequence of entities that you're mistaking for one entity are external to yourself. And Ramakanta says it's not quite so easy to explain how that could happen if we're talking about a sequence of separate entities experiencing themselves as one. Why would a sequence of separate entities experience themselves as one? So imagine that me standing here represents me in this moment, represents my state of consciousness in this moment. And then me standing here is the neighbor to that. This is me in the next moment. Ramakanta is saying, just because I have a neighbor who resembles me very closely and succeeds me very rapidly, why would I experience myself as being that? So Ramakanta thinks the Buddhist hasn't actually managed to explain how it could be the case that the plurality of separate things would experience themselves as one. Now, in your question, you thought that actually Ramakanta is wrong to say that it's easier to explain that when we're dealing with a sequence of external entities. You thought that it's actually easy to explain superimposing onto oneself because of causality, you said. Well, why do you think that causality means it's easier to explain that?
I'm not sure. I think if it's possible that because there's such similarity in all the events that occur in a sequence, and because in the Buddhist theory they also have this concept that we talked about. So they do have this stream of consciousness that runs, right? So maybe the similarity in them is what makes it easier to superimpose it.
Yeah, I mean, we can give any number of examples of a row of separate things with just very, very minute changes between them, where we don't notice the change. Our sense faculties are not sensitive enough, they're not fine-grained enough to pick up very, very minute changes. And so we can easily see how that does happen, but every example we give will always be an example of us observing observing a sequence of things that are external to us. It's very hard to give an example of the plurality of things experiencing themselves as one. One of you two.
So, thank you for your talk. I was thinking about the last argument and was wondering if Buddhists could actually take the Apoha route to answer the repetition because of the problem. Would they not?
So, you're walking along the beach, you see this mother of pearl shell, and you think, oh, there's some silver. Again, everyone can agree that that happens. The point of that argument was that no one would mistake the mother of pearl for silver unless you'd experienced silver previously. And so the argument says to the Buddhist, you're asking us to believe that in every moment of our experience, what we're actually experiencing are momentary things. And for Buddhism, not only our stream of consciousness is momentary, this camera, this tripod is momentary. So actually, I think that this tripod has unbroken temporal extension. But actually, for Buddhism, no, it's one tripod in one moment, another tripod in another moment, another tripod in another moment. What sort of argument does the Buddhists give for that? Well, if we leave the tripod in this room and we come back in a week's time, you probably wouldn't notice much difference. Probably looks exactly the same. Or let's say we have a camera in here taking a photo of the tripod. It takes a photo every week, and you look at the photos in 2 consecutive weeks, it looks exactly the same. But if over the course of 10 years, 15 years, you compare the photos, you'll start to notice changes, the colour will fade. And Buddhism says, how do we explain that? How do we explain that everything changes over time if you look at it over a wide enough time span? Well, one possible explanation would be to say, well, it's exactly the same without any change at all for 3.5 hours or 3.5 days. Then suddenly it changes a bit, and then it's the same. That doesn't seem very satisfactory, does it? And so the way the Buddhists prefer to explain the fact that everything changes over time is that actually everything is undergoing minute changes in every single moment. And just that our senses can't pick it up until the cumulative effect of those changes becomes sufficiently great. So Buddhism thinks that everything is momentary, not only my state of consciousness, but everything I can perceive is momentary. So that means in every moment, I'm constantly superimposing persistent temporal extension onto what is momentary. And this argument says how to make sense of superimposition. Surely we can only make sense of superimposing some concept onto what is actually there if you've experienced something that instantiates that concept earlier. You wouldn't think, oh, this is silver when you see the mother of pearl unless you've experienced silver. So, if the Buddhist is right that we're constantly superimposing persistence, i.e. temporal extension, onto what is momentary, surely we should have experienced something persistent, something temporally extended. But where could we ever do that in a Buddhist universe? Nothing is temporally extended. Now you thought that Apoha could help the Buddhist here. Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion.
I'm thinking of that so because I mean how else would you then also talk about Anumana in that case? And then that self-cognizing cognition where he has that example of need-minded cognition and then cognize the blueness. I mean things like that.
Explain that example. You're looking at a blue jewel.
Yeah, and then you so it will be pratyaksha so long as it is non-conceptual, so the object itself. But then there is a self-cognizing cognition. I think this comes towards the end of the first chapter. It talks about the pratyaksha of Nyāya and Śaivism. So I think there, and he has all these examples of the Rajapashuptikas when they're somebody moving on a chariot and seeing these streets to be moving. These are some classic examples. So I was wondering how that works also, and I think that works through the fact that, and I think he has a shortest sort of discussion on the non-calmness there. So I guess they take that. So basically, when you're cognizing you are actually eliminating all that is.
Yeah, so Ahoha, the doctrine that the questioner is referring to, it's a theory about how, if, as Buddhism claims, only individual particulars are real, only individual momentary particulars are real, how it is we can have in our thinking universal properties such as blueness, which is shared by every blue thing, or cowness, which is a property shared by all cows. And Buddhists have this way of explaining how through Ahoha, which means exclusion, i.e. exclusion of non-blue, exclusion of non-cow, how we can somehow get in our thinking from just separate, momentary individuals to universal properties. I guess I don't quite see yet how you're going to make that work in this context.
So you might see silver, so you might have some impression of silver that they call the non-silver.
Right, if you see it, you see silver, then you're experiencing silver, and that then implies you should be able to experience.
That's the other one. So I mean, how would Anuman work? That's what I'm thinking. If this doesn't work, so
If what doesn't work?
if like nothing exists, or I mean, I know that nothing exists in that world, but Anuman also is not.
No, things exist in a Buddhist world, but they're
As kindly works. So like you could impose blueness or like non-blueness and identify. Similarly, you could do like the same non-silverness and somehow exclude all that.
I see. So even if you've never experienced silver, by excluding non-silver, you somehow end up with silver. I see. So even having never experienced subsistence, by somehow excluding non-subsistence, you arrive at subsistence. I see. Okay.
I think that's one of the
Yeah, maybe, but could be possible.
So the first argument that the Buddhists do not provide sufficient explanation of how something is continuous outside of ourselves, is applicable to something being continuous inside of ourselves, right?
Sorry, say that again.
The mistakenness of the continuity that we make, that Buddhists say we make, is different from for things that are external to us and for things that are internal to us, right?
Yeah.
But is there an explanation in Buddhism about what is external to us and what is internal to us? And also, that should depend on perception, right? You can put things like, you can include things that we consider to be external to us into our internality and vice versa. So are there any
Tell me about that. Tell me about including things which we think are internal, they're actually external, or things which we think are external being internal.
So if we are perceiving something, right? So I'm looking at this ball. So we can say that my idea of this ball is a bit outdated because by the time I perceive it, it's something else. So ideally, it's the bottle is external to us, but its perception has now become internal to us. Like otherwise, we can. Otherwise, you like in a simpler word, you would have put an equation, like the external bottle is the internal perception. But now we've extruded that and included the perception. And I think you can extend it further if you if you assume that the bottle only exists inside of a conception, that our perception is everything that exists. So you can keep including and excluding things. So is there any specific theory which describes how we can do that, and that could be the Buddhist response to this? And also a second point, so the continuous perception of ourselves, right? But that in general, that is true, that we continuously perceive ourselves, and the Buddhist and the Shaivism people kind of agree on that. But some modern disorders in psychology do describe people who have fragmented selves, like the cells shattered in multiple pieces onto nothingness, and it changes over time. So how would that?
Yeah, so the second point was interesting, that according to the debate I presented, I was kind of presenting it as though everyone agrees that we experience ourselves as continuous. We all have this sense of self-continuity. The question was, let's go back to this slide. There are sort of two possible ways in which one can respond to this claim that, well, I experience myself as self-like, i.e. as continuing to exist unbroken. And we saw that in this particular debate, even the Buddhists don't actually opt for one. Even the Buddhists don't deny that phenomenon. And you're interestingly pointing out that maybe one could actually deny that. Maybe it's not actually totally universal, that everyone experiences themselves in that way. There's examples from the experimental psychology literature, the psychopathology literature of fragmented selves, where people really do experience firm disjunctions, firm divides in themselves. Yeah. So those examples would probably favour the Buddhist view. The Buddhist could point to that kind of experience. Now, the first point about where to draw the boundary between external and internal. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. I guess different schools of Indian philosophy will give different answers to this. So in Advaita, in Shankara drawing on the Upanishads, often says that neti neti, meaning this is not myself, meaning the external world is not myself, but then even my thoughts are not myself, my body is not myself, my sense faculties are not myself. My real self transcends all of that. My real self is not to be found in anything that I can actually experience, including my body and my thoughts, my mind, my feelings. None of that is actually self. So for Shankara, the boundary between self and other falls there. In a sense, in one way of looking at it, very little falling on the side of the self. Everything we can experience falls on the side of the not-self. But actually, Shankara, the only thing in the universe that is real is the self. So in that sense, there's quite a lot that falls on the side of the self, no self-boundary. For Buddhism, you have to look to different branches of Buddhism. So there were Buddhists who were idealists. The branch of Buddhism known as Yogacara Buddhism or Vijnanavada Buddhism, they held that actually even objects that we think are external to ourselves, tables and chairs, are all actually just my consciousness taking on form. That might sound bizarre. You might think, how can that table be my consciousness? I'm over here and the table's over there. There's some space separating me from the table. What are these Buddhists talking about? Well, when you dream, let's say you dream of being chased by a tiger, there's some space between you and the tiger. But if someone is in your bedroom while you're having that dream, looking at you, looking at the room, there's no tiger in the room. So it's natural to explain that tiger image by saying that the tiger image is just in your consciousness. So just every night in dreaming, we have examples of things which are in our consciousness, but which we experience as at some distance of separation from us. And idealists amongst the various schools of Indian philosophy, not only Buddhist idealists, but other idealists, claim that actually what's happening there in dreaming is happening in waking experience too. And in waking experience too, these tables and chairs are being projected by my consciousness. So in that case, these tables and chairs fall within, they don't fall on the other side of the self-other divide. Yeah, maybe that's enough. Sorry if I didn't fully answer your question.
Yeah, so like since we're arguing about humanitarianism, in the first part, can't the Vijnanavadan say that again there is no for Jnanasya at least there is no difference between internal and external, right? And then he can also go on to say that Ramakant is saying that you have one is there's no momentary. How can you have a momentary experience while? Could you just go to the first argument there and the second argument because both of them are sort of related.
Yeah.
In the first one, Vijnanavadan couldn't he just say that an identity of a self is formed through nurturing or through I and the other throughout childhood, and then the momentariness is a property of awareness rather than is a property of awareness itself. So for the Buddhists, the momentariness comes as a meditative experience rather than a normal experience, like in the Yogacara Bhumi, Abhidharma Koshavasya, many other texts. Couldn't then momentariness be explained? Momentariness, therefore, would not be conceptual; it would be non-conceptual. And our experience of ourselves as selves, as having a continual temporal identity, would be conceptual. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, you are, yeah. So, the speaker began by mentioning Nyāya and Śaivism, the most difficult of Sanskrit philosophers, very tough. There's no philosophical Sanskrit tougher than Nyāya and Śaivism, the late Buddhist. Now, you were asked what's the difference between the first argument and the second. Well, the second argument targets the idea that we superimpose existence onto what is momentary. And it claims that we wouldn't be able to do that unless we experience existence object. That's slightly different from the first argument, which targeted the idea of, the difference between superimposing onto external things and superimposing onto oneself. The first argument was about the difficulty of explaining superimposition onto oneself. The second argument was about, even if we're talking about superimposing onto things other than oneself, there's a problem. So can you see now how there's a difference between the two?
Yeah. For the second one, I gave the example of the identity, how an identity could get formed through this. Then you could have like a
An identity could be formed through.
the identity of a self or continuing self could be formed due to the lack of awareness itself. Because the child is not aware of his things. That is why momentariness is a meditative experience, rather than like a general thing that you would have. That's why you could not give a very good example of momentariness. Of course, only in cognition itself, like a normal example would not suffice.
Yeah, I mean, this is touching on the question of the extent to which Buddhists would say we do experience momentariness, and the extent to which they would say we don't experience momentariness. Now, these Buddhists like Nyāya and Śaivism, who you mentioned, believed in yogi pratyakṣa. So this particular branch of Buddhism took on this idea of yogi pratyakṣa, yogic perception, from more Hindu-inclined schools of Indian philosophy. And of course, the content of yogic perception, Buddhism is very different from the content of yogic perception for non-Buddhists. You won't be surprised that according to Buddhists, yogins perceive momentariness. According to Nyāyikas, yogins perceive non-momentariness. So each different school claimed that yogins experience exactly what is claimed by the doctrines of the particular school or system in question. So Buddhists in this particular school of Dignaga and Dharmakirti and Nyāya and Śaivism believed in the validity of yogic perception. They believed yogins have the power to perceive things in meditative states of absorption, which the rest of us can't perceive, including the experience of momentariness. So through a process of very rigorous training of abhyasa, eventually the yogin and the advanced meditator will start to not just know conceptually that everything is momentary, but will be able to start perceiving the distinction between moments. Their perception will become so fine-grained that they can actually perceive momentariness. So that looks like there's a distinction between yogins who can perceive momentariness and the rest of us who can't. But actually there's a sense of Dharmakirti and his followers, including Nyāya and Śaivism, in which all of us are perceiving momentariness the whole time. Because remember what I said, that for Dignaga and Dharmakirti, all of us might think we're perceiving ourselves and external objects as temporally extended, but actually we're not. We're experiencing a sequence of momentary entities. And they even say at many places, Dharmakirti says, Dharmottara says, Kamalashiva says, Nyāya and Śaivism says that there's a sense in which all of us actually are experiencing momentariness the whole time. We just don't realize we're experiencing it. It's the reason that the difference between the yogin and the non-yogin is actually to be explained along the lines that, well, actually we're all of us perceiving momentariness. It's just only the yogin realizes that they're perceiving momentariness. So the difference between the yogin and the non-yogin is a question of adhyavasaya, judgment, conceptual experience. The yogin actually has adhyavasaya, that they are perceiving momentariness, the rest of us don't.
So I think we have about 10 minutes more. I think we can go on. If there are some students here who have a full class, please leave quiet. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the gulab jamun. So what is that word there is really moving?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it is dangerous to, if they are doing it, if they are doing it, that's what the Nyāyikas are doing. So with self, which I'm sure they are not. Self with love. What I'm trying to say is that this also can be actually dangerous for the Nyāyikas, because if they say that yes, I have experienced gulab jamun and I loved it, and a few years down the line I see it again and desire arises in me from gulab jamun. And that is an argument for continuous self. That's an argument. But it's possible that I had something long ago and quite forgotten, and it doesn't evoke the desire. So, what exactly is memory doing there in an argument for self?
Yeah, interesting. So this is about this argument, and to take the last point first, to take this point that we may have experienced pleasure from the gulab jamun in the past, and then 2 years later we see one, but we don't feel desire for it because we've forgotten. The question is that a problem for the Nyāya argument? Because it looks like the Nyāya argument is based on the idea that if you've experienced pleasure from something before, then you experience desire for it. How about if you've forgotten the fact that it gave you pleasure? Or, to take the corresponding example, how about if you're seeing the gulab jamun for the first time, but you think, oh, that looks quite nice. You feel desire for it without ever having experienced pleasure for it. Actually, I don't think either of those cases are a problem for the Nyāya argument. So all that the Nyāya philosopher needs is that there's a statistically higher chance of feeling desire in figure 1 and a statistically lower chance of desire arising in figure 2. If it's statistically significant, which surely it is, if we were to do a survey and we were able to count all the number of times that you feel desire, something that causes you pleasure in advance, and you compare that with the number of times you don't feel desire, there's going to be more of a correlation between, it's going to be more common that you feel desire. One, even if there are some cases where you don't. And it's clear it's going to be more common that you don't feel desire, even if there are some cases where you do, just out of curiosity. Having never.
Let's just put about what is it significant as an argument for self, for the self. If we want to tie it up with memory.
Yeah, well, memory is absolutely at the core of this argument. So I think I probably could have presented a simplified version of this argument without mentioning pleasure, without mentioning desire, but only focusing on memory. The point is that we are able to remember things that we have experienced, and we're not able to remember things that other people have experienced. And the Nyāya argument could just be based on those two facts, without even mentioning pleasure or desire. Really, at the heart of this argument is memory, and the question of whether, if you remember something, if you remember some experience, that means that you must be the subject of both the present memory and the earlier experience. That's the core disagreement here. The core disagreement is Nyāya thinks that it's impossible to remember some experience that you were not the experiencer of. But Buddhism says no. Actually, when you remember something, when you remember you remember having dinner last night, actually it was not you having dinner last night. It was a sort of ancestor in your stream of consciousness. It was a moment upstream from now. And because of this Buddhist idea that memory traces can be passed along the line, Buddhists think that actually remembering experience does not imply that you were also subject of that experience. But yeah, Nyāya certainly doesn't equate the self with memory. Yeah. Memory is one of those small circles. So memory is one of these things which is a quality inhering in the self.
So, you mentioned that Ramatanta, for Ramatanta,
the self is basically equated with consciousness, and then consciousness continues in deep sleep. But one can argue that in deep sleep I'm actually not aware, and I don't have like, and if there is a subject, then there necessarily needs to be an object for the subject to perceive something. In deep sleep, the subject does not have any object to perceive, so that puts the identity in perspective.
Yeah, nice question. Yeah, if you're right, if it's true that subject needs an object, then Ramakanta's position is impossible. So Ramakanta will deny that. Ramakanta will say you can have a subject without an object, you can have consciousness without an object. So it may seem a strange idea, but maybe I'll just quickly sketch three different or two different views on this question. Nyāya maintains that consciousness is not equated with the self. Consciousness is a kind of momentary thing which arises in the self. You'll remember that for Nyāya too, consciousness is momentary. So that means the self can exist without consciousness, no problem. Nyāya doesn't have to claim that in deep sleep there is consciousness. Nyāya doesn't have to claim that in coma, states of coma or anesthesia, there is consciousness. And for Nyāya, if someone is lucky enough to attain moksha through the path of Nyāya, they claim that what will thereby be achieved is a state of non-consciousness. So Nyāya was ridiculed about this by people who said that they rather than achieving moksha according to Nyāya, in which one becomes completely non-conscious, as unconscious as a rock, they would rather be born as a deer in the deer park outside Varanasi. But that is the Nyāya view, that in moksha the self continues, but there's no consciousness. For Ramakanta, that's not the case, obviously, because if for Ramakanta consciousness ceased, then the self would have to cease. They're identical. So for Ramakanta, in the state of moksha, the state of liberation, the light is still on. It's not like Nyāya moksha where the light just goes off. For Ramakanta's Shaiva moksha, the light is still on, consciousness is still there, but there are no objects of consciousness, no contents of consciousness. So it's a bit like light shining out into empty space, but without any object to reflect on. It's not dark. The sun is shining, but it's just shining in a vacuum. There's no shining into empty space. It's not being reflected back to the subject. The subject doesn't experience that. This was also the view of Vedanta and Sankhya. They didn't want there to be any objects of experience in moksha, because if there are objects of experience, that would imply some change. And they wanted moksha to be a totally changeless state. They thought that if there are different changing objects of experience in moksha, then you'll probably experience some raga or dvesha, some attachment to certain objects, some sadness when one object ceases. So you wouldn't have total equanimity. It's thought to be desirable.
So for Ramakanta, we attain moksha every sleep.
That's a good question. No, the answer is no. But then the question is why? How would Ramakanta explain the difference? I guess in states of deep sleep, we still have the samskaras, we still have the latent habits, which as soon as we wake up will go into action. bring up our raga and dvesha, likes, dislikes, desire, aversion. Whereas in states of moksha, there's none of these samskaras left, none of those habitual tendencies left. But whether it's phenomenologically the same, I'm not sure what Brahmapansa would say about that.
Okay, I see there's still a couple of hands up, but maybe we can continue this conversation over tea in this case. Thank you all for coming. Please join me in applause to thank the